December 1944, the deadliest winter of the war. Surrounded, starving, freezing, the 101st faced certain death. But one man carried no weapon, only a song. A hymn banned by his own commanders, yet that song would silence an entire battlefield. And for one night, peace returned to war. Now, let's go back to Bastogne and see how it all began. December 1944, the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was raging with unprecedented fury, and American forces found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and facing what many believed would be their final Christmas. The temperature had plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and soldiers on both sides were dying not just from bullets and shrapnel, but from the brutal cold that turned breath into ice crystals and made metal too painful to touch with bare skin. In this hellscape of war, there was a man who carried no rifle, wore no armor, and commanded no troops. Chaplain Henry Gerecke served with the 101st Airborne Division, but his weapon wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was something far more dangerous to the enemy's morale, something that would prove more effective than any military strategy the generals had devised. But before we dive into that miraculous night, let me paint you a picture of just how desperate the situation had become. American troops were trapped in what military historians now call the most brutal winter offensive of the entire European theater. German forces had launched a surprise attack that caught Allied commanders completely off guard, pushing through American lines like a knife through butter. The 101st Airborne, along with several other units, found themselves completely encircled in the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Supply lines were cut, ammunition was running dangerously low, medical supplies were almost exhausted. Men were sharing single blankets between 3 soldiers, huddling together in foxholes that had become frozen graves for too many of their brothers. The wounded couldn't be evacuated because German artillery made any movement during daylight hours a death sentence. At night, the temperature dropped so low that plasma bottles froze solid, making blood transfusions impossible. Chaplain Gerecke moved between these foxholes every single night, offering what comfort he could to men who were quite literally freezing to death. He'd grown up in a small farming community in Missouri, where his father had taught him that music could heal wounds that medicine couldn't reach. His mother, a church organist, had shown him how certain melodies could touch something deep in the human soul, something that transcended language, nationality, and even hatred. Now, you might be wondering what made this particular hymn forbidden. The answer lies in a decision made by Allied command early in the war. Military leadership had determined that certain religious songs, particularly those with German origins, should not be sung by Allied troops. The reasoning was practical. They didn't want to risk any confusion on the battlefield, didn't want enemy soldiers potentially recognizing familiar melodies and using them to their advantage. But Chaplain Gerecke knew something that the generals didn't. He understood that some songs are bigger than war, bigger than the temporary hatred between nations. He'd studied theology, but more importantly, he'd studied people. He knew that in the deepest, darkest moments of human experience, music could reach places that words alone never could. On the night of December 23rd, 1944, something extraordinary happened. The temperature had dropped even further, reaching what meteorologists later confirmed was the coldest night of that entire brutal winter. American positions were taking constant harassment fire from German snipers. Every few minutes, the crack of a rifle would echo through the frozen forest, followed by either the thud of a bullet hitting sandbags or the terrible cry of another wounded soldier. Chaplain Gerecke had been making his rounds, moving from foxhole to foxhole, with a determination that amazed even the most hardened combat veterans. These men had seen him risk his life dozens of times, crawling through snow and mud to reach wounded soldiers, never carrying anything but a small field medical kit and his prayer book. They called him the Ghost, not because he was hard to see, but because he seemed to appear wherever he was needed most, almost as if he could sense suffering from impossible distances. That night, he stopped at a foxhole, where 3 young soldiers were sharing a single cigarette, trying to get whatever warmth they could from the tiny ember. One of them, a 19-year-old private from Ohio named Tommy Richardson, was shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. He'd been in combat for 6 months, had seen too much, lost too many friends. His hands wouldn't stop trembling, and his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that medics were starting to recognize as shell shock. Gerecke sat down in the snow beside the foxhole, and for several minutes, he didn't say a word. He just listened to the sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the crack of sniper fire, the whispered prayers of men who thought they might not see another sunrise. Then, almost without thinking, he began to hum a melody that he'd learned as a child, sitting in his mother's kitchen while she prepared Sunday dinner. The melody was simple, haunting, and somehow familiar even to men who had never heard it before. Within moments, Tommy Richardson stopped shaking. The other soldiers in nearby foxholes began to quiet down, straining to hear this strange, beautiful sound that seemed so completely out of place in the middle of a battlefield. What happened next is documented in multiple military reports, though many historians initially dismissed the accounts as wartime folklore. Chaplain Gerecke began to sing, softly at first, then with growing confidence as his voice carried across the frozen landscape. The song he chose was Silent Night, but he sang it in its original German. Now, here's where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Within minutes of Gerecke beginning to sing, something unprecedented happened on that battlefield. The German sniper fire stopped. Not gradually, not hesitantly, but completely and suddenly. The harassment artillery that had been pounding American positions every few minutes fell silent. Across no man's land, in German foxholes and machine gun nests, enemy soldiers stopped what they were doing to listen. One American soldier later wrote in his diary that it was like watching magic happen. The entire battlefield, where moments before men had been trying to kill each other, fell into an eerie, peaceful quiet. The only sounds were Chaplain Gerecke's voice, carrying across the frozen forest, and the gentle whisper of snow beginning to fall. But the real miracle was what happened next. From somewhere in the German lines, a voice joined in, then another, then another. German soldiers, men who had been shooting at these Americans just minutes before, began singing along with this allied chaplain. The forbidden hymn had become a bridge across the most bitter divide imaginable, the space between enemies in wartime. Military historians have spent decades trying to explain what happened that night. Some point to the psychological impact of familiar music during extreme stress. Others suggest that the shared Christian heritage of most German and American soldiers created an unexpected moment of common ground. A few more cynical analysts have argued that both sides were simply too exhausted, too cold, and too demoralized to continue fighting. But the soldiers who were there knew they had witnessed something that couldn't be explained by psychology or strategy or exhaustion. They had seen the power of human connection overcome the machinery of war, even if only for a few precious hours. The singing continued for almost 2 hours, not just Silent Night, but other hymns that soldiers on both sides recognized. Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art. Each song seemed to build on the last, creating a strange, beautiful concert in the middle of one of the war's most brutal battles. American soldiers reported seeing German troops standing on their parapets, silhouetted against the starlit sky, singing with voices that carried impossible distances in the frozen air. Tommy Richardson, the young private who had been shaking uncontrollably, later said that those 2 hours were the first time in 6 months that he felt truly human again. Not like a weapon, not like a target, just like a 19-year-old kid who missed his mother's cooking and his girlfriend's letters. The trembling in his hands stopped completely, and for the first time since landing in Normandy, he slept through the night without nightmares. When dawn broke on December 24th, Christmas Eve 1944, both sides seemed to have made an unspoken agreement. There would be no attacks that day, no artillery barrages, no sniper fire, no attempts to gain tactical advantage. German and American soldiers could be seen moving openly in their trenches, and some reports suggest that a few brave souls from both sides actually met in no man's land to share cigarettes and show pictures of their families. The ceasefire lasted exactly 24 hours. On Christmas morning, as if responding to some invisible signal, both armies returned to their positions and resumed fighting. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, claiming thousands more lives before the German offensive finally collapsed. But for one perfect night and day, Chaplain Gerecke's forbidden hymn had accomplished what no general's strategy could achieve. The military brass were not pleased. When reports of the singing incident reached headquarters, several officers demanded that Gerecke be court-martialed for fraternizing with the enemy. They argued that his actions had compromised operational security, potentially given away American positions, and violated direct orders about maintaining proper military bearing in combat situations. But something interesting happened when investigators began interviewing the soldiers who had been there. Every single man, from privates to sergeants to junior officers, reported that morale in their units had improved dramatically after that night. The shell shock cases decreased, soldiers were sleeping better, fighting more effectively, and showing increased unit cohesion. Whatever Chaplain Gerecke had done, it had made them better soldiers, not worse ones. The court-martial charges were quietly dropped. Officially, the incident never happened. The forbidden hymn was never mentioned in after-action reports, never included in unit histories, never acknowledged by military leadership. But the soldiers remembered. They carried the story with them for the rest of their lives, sharing it with their children and grandchildren, ensuring that this moment of impossible beauty in the midst of unimaginable horror would never be completely forgotten. Chaplain Henry Gerecke survived the war. He returned to Missouri, where he continued serving as a minister for another 30 years. He rarely spoke about what happened that night in the Ardennes forest, and when he did, he always insisted that he hadn't done anything special. He'd simply sung a song that reminded everyone present that beneath their uniforms, beneath their national identities, beneath their temporary roles as enemies, they were all human beings who missed their homes and loved their families. The power of that forbidden hymn wasn't in its religious message, though that certainly played a role. The real power was in its ability to remind mortal enemies that they shared something more fundamental than their differences. In a moment when war had reduced human beings to targets and statistics, music restored their humanity. This story teaches us something profound about the nature of conflict and connection. Even in the most extreme circumstances, even when people have been trained to see each other as enemies, there are forces that can bridge those divides. Music, art, shared memories, common hopes. These things don't eliminate the causes of conflict, but they remind us that our enemies are also human beings with families, fears, and dreams remarkably similar to our own. The forbidden hymn of World War II shows us that sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones that bring peace instead of destruction. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight harder, but to remind everyone why fighting should eventually end. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of human history, a simple song can accomplish what armies cannot. It can help us remember that we're all part of the same human family, even when we've temporarily forgotten how to act like it. That night in the Ardennes forest, Chaplain Gerecke didn't stop a war, but for a few precious hours, he reminded everyone within the sound of his voice that peace was possible, that humanity could survive even the most brutal circumstances, and that some things, love, hope, the longing for home, are bigger than any conflict we might create.